Northwest Ohio, there's a story that's been told for generations. Not in books or official records, but in conversations, late-night drives, and local memory. It's known as the Elmore Rider. Depending on who tells it, the details change. A motorcycle, a bridge, a returning soldier, a light scene where no one should be riding. Stories like this are often dismissed or sensationalized, but repetition matters. When a place is named again and again, when behavior changes because of a story, that story becomes part of local history, whether it can be fully proven or not. This episode isn't about proving the supernatural. It's about understanding how the Elmore Rider became attached to Elmore, what can be documented, what's been passed down, and where the record goes silent. Often the most important part of a legend isn't whether it happened exactly as told, but why it continues to be told at all. Before there was a story, there was a place. Elmore sits along a quiet stretch of northwest Ohio, shaped by rail lines, farmland, and the narrow roads that connect small towns to one another. It's a landscape defined by rural distances, narrow roads, and the absence of lighting beyond town limits. In the early 20th century, these roads weren't necessarily designed for speed or safety. Creek crossings were common. Bridges were low and often unlit. At night, visibility depended almost entirely on a single headlamp cutting through open fields and tree lines. This matters because legends don't form just anywhere. They attach themselves to places that feel transitional. Bridges, bends in the road, stretches where one space ends and another begins. Around Elmore, several such crossings exist. Over time, different versions of the Elmore Rider story have pointed to different roads, different bridges, sometimes only a few miles apart. But that inconsistency isn't a flaw, it's more of a clue. It tells us the story wasn't born from a single signpost or landmark. It grew out of a landscape that already carried risk, isolation, and memory. To understand the Elmore Rider, you have to start here. Not with what people say they saw, but with the roads they were traveling and the conditions that made those roads dangerous long before they were legendary. By the mid to late 20th century, a story had attached itself to this landscape. It was already being told locally, repeated often enough that details became familiar, even when they weren't consistent. Over time, it came to be known as the Elmore Rider. What can be confirmed is not the actual event itself, but the persistence of the story. The Elmore Rider appears in local conversations, regional media coverage, library programming, and informal tourism writing. It's referenced as something people from the area are expected to recognize, even if they disagree on the specifics. That persistence matters. Legends that vanish quickly leave little trace. Legends that endure begin to shape how places are remembered, visited, and talked about. In Elmore, the rider isn't tied to a single retelling. Different versions point to different roads. Different tellers emphasize different details. Some describe a bridge, others a curve in the road. Some are precise, others are vague. What stays consistent throughout is the name, the setting, and the idea that something happened there. Something serious enough that it left an impression on the place and the people who live there. From a historical perspective, this is where the Elmore Rider firmly exists. Not as a verified event, but as a stable place of regional folklore connected to Elmore and its surrounding roads. Understanding that distinction between a story being true and a story being established is essential before looking any closer at the details themselves. In its most commonly told form, the Elmore Rider story goes something like this. A young man returns home from military service, most often described as having served during the First World War. Shortly after his return, he takes a motorcycle out along the rural roads near Elmore. Somewhere near a bridge or a creek crossing, the ride ends in a fatal accident. In many versions, the crash is described as unusually violent. The rider is said to have been decapitated, sometimes by a fence, sometimes by a wire, sometimes by the structure of the bridge itself. In some tellings, his body is found, but his head is not. After that, the story shifts from accident to aftermath. People describe seeing a single light along the road at night, often compared to a motorcycle headlamp. The light appears where no rider should be, moving through stretches of road associated with the crash. Over time, the story stops identifying an individual person and instead refers to the figure simply as the rider. This version of the story has been repeated for decades. The order of events is familiar, the imagery is consistent, but the details, the dates, locations, and even the exact cause of the accident shift depending on who tells it. That instability is important. It suggests that what survived wasn't a precise historical record, but a narrative shape, one that can be retold without ever fully settling on a single fixed version. At some point, the Elmore Rider stopped being just a story and began to shape behavior. Visitors to the area describe a set of actions they're told to perform. Park near the road, flash headlights, honk the horn, often a specific number of times, then wait. These actions are sometimes described as a way to summon the rider. But what matters historically is not the intentions behind them. What matters is that the ritual exists at all. Rituals don't form around stories that are easily forgotten. They form around places that already carry meaning, risk, or uncertainty. Repetition turns a narrative into something participatory. Alongside the ritual are reports of lights, often described as a single point of brightness moving along the road at night. Some compare it to a motorcycle headlamp. Others describe it more vaguely, as something approaching and then disappearing. These sightings are reported experiences, not verified observations. They vary in detail, timing, and location, but they're consistent in one important way. They happen in places already identified in the story. From a historical standpoint, this is where folklore becomes anchored. The ritual reinforces the location reinforces the story, and the story, in turn, influences how people move through that space, especially after dark. Whether anything unusual is actually seen is ultimately less important than the fact that people continue to return, repeat the same actions, and leave with a sense that they've participated in something older than themselves. That cycle, story, place, behavior, repetition, is how a legend sustains itself long after its origin has faded from the record. When a story is told long enough, details begin to harden. Dates appear, motives solidify, locations become specific. The Elmore Rider is no exception. Many versions of the story place the accident in the years just after the First World War. Some describe a specific night, others suggest a known bridge or crossing near Elmore. Over time, these details are often repeated as fact. But when those claims are tested against the historical record, the picture becomes less certain. Researchers and local writers have looked for contemporary newspaper accounts of a fatal motorcycle accident matching the story's description. So far, no widely cited report has been found that confirms the full sequence of events, as it's normally told. Death records from the period can document accidents, but they don't always include the level of detail the legend provides. And without a consistently named individual or a confirmed location, it becomes difficult to link any single record directly to the story. This doesn't mean that no accident occurred. Early 20th century rural roads were dangerous, and motorcycle fatalities were not unheard of. It means only that the specific version preserved in the legend has not been conclusively matched to a surviving document. In historical terms, that distinction matters. What can be verified is the story's persistence, its repeated association with the area, and its presence in local memory. What cannot yet be verified is a single, definitive event that accounts for every detail that followed. At this point, the record doesn't give us a clear origin. Instead, it gives us a boundary between what can be supported by documents and what exists because it has been remembered, repeated, and believed. When records fall short, curiosity usually follows, and people often try to find ways to test it. By the late 1960s, the Elmore Rider was no longer just something people talked about. It was something that some tried to test. One of the earliest figures repeatedly associated with these efforts is Richard Gill, a local ghost hunter who, according to later accounts, conducted informal experiments near one of the bridges linked to the story. In 1969, Gill reportedly stretched a string across the roadway, attempting to determine whether the light people described was physical, something that could interact with the environment, or simply an illusion. There is no surviving formal documentation of these tests, and no published findings that I could find. What matters historically is not the result, but the impulse behind it. By this point, the story had reached a stage where people were no longer satisfied with just retelling it. They wanted to measure it. The same impulse appears again in the 1970s, when students from Bowling Green State University reportedly traveled to the area in an attempt to document the phenomenon on film. These efforts are mentioned in later summaries of the legend, but I could find no surviving footage or academic papers to cite. Like Gill's experiments, these attempts don't provide verification. What they do provide is evidence of attention. The Elmore Rider had moved beyond casual folklore and into a space where people believed it was worth recording. That shift became more visible in 1989 when local TV station WTOL 11 aired a segment on the legend. This broadcast marks one of the earliest high-profile moments when the Elmore Rider entered into regional media, reaching audiences far beyond Elmore itself. Media coverage doesn't settle a story, but it does stabilize it. Once a legend is broadcast, certain details tend to repeat more often, while others fade away. The story becomes easier to recognize, even as the origins remain unclear. This is how legends like the Elmore Rider evolve. Early uncertainty invites investigation. Investigation attracts attention. Attention reinforces repetition, and repetition, over time, can give a story the appearance of certainty, even when the underlying record remains incomplete. The result isn't deception, it's convergence. A loose collection of experiences, questions, and retellings gradually settles into a familiar shape, not because every detail was confirmed, but because the story itself proved durable enough to survive scrutiny without resolution. By this point, it should be clear that the Elmore Rider survives less as an event than as a presence in local memory. Stories like this don't endure because every detail can be proven. They endure because they attach themselves to real places, real risks, and shared experience. Rural roads, poor visibility, a moment where something went wrong, or at least could have. In that sense, the Elmore Rider functions as more than a ghost story. It is a reminder of how people once moved through this landscape and how dangerous that movement could be. Before guardrails, before lighting, before modern traffic controls, these roads demanded attention, and sometimes exacted a cost, especially if that attention lapsed. The legend also reflects how communities remember loss when the records are incomplete. When names disappear, roles remain. The rider becomes not a person with a biography, but a figure tied to the road itself. That shift doesn't diminish the story, it explains how it persists. In and around Elmore, the rider persists because the setting hasn't changed as much as the world around it. The same stretches of road still exist, the same crossings, the same sense that certain places ask for caution, especially after dark. Whether the legend began with a single accident, multiple incidents, or a broader awareness of danger may never fully be known. What is clear is that the story continues to shape how people talk about this place and how they move through it. That influence is real, and in the study of local history, influence matters as much as origin. The Elmore Rider doesn't persist because it was ever proven. It persists because it became part of a real place and a real sense of caution tied to that place. The historical record leaves gaps. Some details remain unverified, but the story's influence is not in dispute. Anyone who wants to understand that influence doesn't need to believe anything at all. They only need to look at the roads, the crossing, and the landscape around Elmore. The same terrain that shaped the story and continues to carry it today. This episode marks the boundary between record and memory. What lies on the other side may differ, but both belong in the history of this place. And that, more than certainty, is what endures.